What I'd like to do is an abbreviated version of our pull request workflow exercise. I mentioned at the beginning of our workshop that you can adopt this pull request workflow yourself to help you review the code when you're working by yourself, or you can adopt this pull request workflow if you're working on a team where everyone has access to the same repo. Or you can adopt this pull request workflow if you are working on an open source project where you don't have access to the repository. In either of those use cases, we'll be using pull request workflow. So let's take some final moments in our workshop today for me to talk to you about pull request workflow. So we're going to do an abbreviated version of this pull request workflow exercise. We can use the repository that we have just been working in. In this exercise, we're going to deal with the concept of branches, which are like a different state of our repository. And we're also going to deal with something called a pull request, which is an opportunity for formal review of your code. By following along with me, we'll get practice using branches, different states or different realities of it's like a different state of your repository. And we'll talk about why that might be helpful. And then we'll go through the process of creating what's known as a pull request and merging it back in. So those are our goals for this exercise. So for this exercise, let's use the repository that you have been working in over the past few minutes. So step 1 is done. And step 2 is done as well. Step 3 is talking to us about this concept called a branch. We're going to create a new branch. So far, we've just been using the default state of our repository. It's called the main branch. And what we see on GitHub is the current state of our main branch. On GitHub, there's a drop down near the top left of the repository homepage that allows us to select different branches of our repository. In other words, different realities or different states of the code. Generally, the main branch will want to keep it clean and make sure that any code that exists on the main branch or the default state of our repository is working. And when we deploy our coding applications to a user-facing server, generally, the users will see whatever state of the code is on the main branch. But how do we have an opportunity to try some things out without affecting that working state of the code on the main branch? This is what the branching process is about. What we're going to do is keep the main branch the way it is in a working state of the code so that some users who are using our application are using a stable version of the code, but we often might want to work on new features or something like that. So what we're going to do is make a new branch, have the opportunity to change our code, mess it up, do some updates, and we'll do so on the branch, keeping that separate from the main branch. Then we'll push our code up to GitHub and then review it. And then only after we've reviewed our code on GitHub, and if it looks good, then we will merge our branch into the main branch, and that's how we'll update our code. So this is like a more formal opportunity for review before the code hits the main branch. So I just explained the concept of branches. Let's get some hands-on experience with branches, and maybe this will start to make more sense. We're going to check out a new branch. We're going to make some changes to our code and make a commit on the branch. When we make a commit on the branch, it won't affect the state of the code on our main branch. We're going to push our feature branch up to GitHub and create a pull request to review it on GitHub, and then we'll merge the changes in. So that's what we're about to do. And I'm going to lead you through this in a hands-on way. So from GitHub Desktop, we've been working in a version controlled workflow, and that's great. So far, we've just been making our commits on the main branch. Here you see from this drop down at the top, the main branch is selected. But from this drop down, we can also create a new branch, and let's do that now. From this branch drop down, let's click the button to create a new branch. We'll give our branch a name like my new feature. When you're working on a team with multiple developers, you might adopt some team preferences about how to name your branches, like start the name of your branch with your initials, just to make sure that different people aren't working on other people's branches if they're not meaning to. But anyway, we're going to create a new branch right now, and maybe we'll call it like my new feature or something like that, and then click the button to create that branch. At this time, we now see that that new branch is reflected on the drop-down menu. Now, any changes we make and any commits we make will only be made on this specific branch, but not the main branch. So at this time, what we're going to do is make some more changes to our code. So I'm going to go back into the text editor and modify the README a little bit. Like, this is a new feature, for example. You can imagine that we might be adding some Python files or modifying some Python files, making some new feature, and we want to be able to test it out and review it before that new feature reaches our end users, before the code reaches the main branch, the default state. So after saving these updates in the text editor, just go back to GitHub Desktop Software and repeat our version control workflow. And we're going to make a commit. Before we do, we see that our new branch is reflected. So when we make this commit, it's going to be made on the new branch. So this is like my new feature, maybe will be the commit message. And now I'm going to click the button to create this commit. When we do that, and when we view the history for this branch, our new feature branch, we see that that commit is reflected. At any time, we could pop back to the main branch, select the main branch, and we see it reflects a totally different state of our repository without the newest features reflected. And this is the concept of branching. There's two different states of our repository. The main branch only has 3 commits on it. If we switch back to this new feature branch, it has 4 commits and some new work. So Git is able to maintain multiple versions of your repository, allowing you an opportunity to try some things out without your efforts messing up your main branch. Now what we're going to do is upload our code to GitHub by publishing this branch. Here we see from the GitHub Desktop menu, after we made a commit on the branch, it's prompting us to go publish that branch up to GitHub by clicking this button at the top or the blue button. So let's do it. Publish the branch. Now our GitHub repository will know about our branch. Let's go check it out. Our GitHub repository, now if we refresh the homepage and go back into the branch dropdown, now the GitHub repository knows about this new branch. You can see that whenever we publish a new branch up to GitHub, it's also prompting us through the front end interface to do the next step in this process, which is to create a pull request. So we could do it here using the green button from GitHub, or from GitHub Desktop, we're also being prompted to create that pull request. So you could either use this blue button in GitHub Desktop or the green button in GitHub. The next step we're about to do is create a pull request. which will give us a formal opportunity to review some things before we merge our changes in. So I'm just going to create this pull request, not a draft or preview or anything. So you can click this green button to create that pull request. All right. Now on GitHub, it's asking us to create a pull request. So we'll give a name, and I'll just call this like, yeah, my new feature. Sounds good. After we give this pull request a title, we can optionally give a description to provide some context about what this pull request is. Hey, we're developing a new feature and we want to review it before we merge into the main branch. I don't know, some kind of context there. But importantly, we're going to create a pull request by clicking this green button. Now we're seeing a screen in our GitHub repository that we haven't really looked at yet, and it's accessible from the pull request menu. So sure, before we've been looking at the home page of our repository, but from the tabs at the top, you see that we can always view any open pull requests like the ones we just created. So here, by clicking the pull request tab, we see the pull request we just created. And by clicking on that one, we now see more information about this pull request. You'll see that there's a formal opportunity for review here. So you can ask collaborators to review your code. And this facilitates a code review process with you and your teammates, or with you and some open source maintainers of some repository that you're contributing to. So in a moment, we'll concern ourselves with a review process before we go merging this code in. But let me share with you, like, the whole point of this pull request process is that it allows you to make multiple commits on your branch and then review them all once you're ready. So we might do one more commit on our branch and push it up before we do our final review process. Like updating the README file. This is like another change on our new feature branch. And I'm just going to save this file and make a commit. Here, I'm still in GitHub Desktop. I'm still on my new feature branch. And here's where I'll make the second new commit on this branch. So this is like a second commit on our feature branch, something like that. That's my commit message. And now I'll click this button to actually create that commit. So I'm just repeating this commit process on the feature branch and then push the code up to the remote branch on GitHub. So you might need to use a number of commits as you're working on your new feature, working incrementally, eventually push all your code up to a branch on GitHub and create that pull request, which allows us a formal opportunity for review. So the final thing we're going to do in our workshop today is review this pull request and then merge it in. Back on GitHub, we see that a number of commits that we've been making on our feature branch and then pushing up here to GitHub are reflected. So we see our first new feature commit from a few moments ago, as well as that second one, that second commit that I just made recently. So here in the conversation tab, you can view all the commits and make some comments, like talking about the code, asking questions, making some notes. We can give our own comments on the pull request, And that's something we could do from the conversation tab. Collaborating with our peer, hey, can you review this? Or, hey, I have a question for you about this code. Can you follow up, or asking someone to do something? So we could use the conversation tab to have a conversation about these proposed changes. The commits tab will show us the commits on this feature branch. The files changed tab will show us how the files have changed between this branch and the main branch. So we could use the files change tab to complete our review. If you're working on a team, here's where you can ask for a reviewer and assign them to review your work. And then they'll come back and complete their review. Maybe they'll give you some comments, and that's all good. And finally, once everything looks good and the team feels that the code is ready to merge into the main branch and release to end users, that's when we'll do the final step in our process, which is to merge this pull request. After you have made a few commits on a branch locally using GitHub desktop software, and after you've pushed those commits up to GitHub and created a pull request, which gives us this interface to review all of those changes, if everything looks good, now the final step is to merge these changes back into the main branch. So from the conversation tab on your pull request, scrolling down to the bottom, this big green button will allow you to merge the code in. And there's a drop down that allows you to do this in different ways. I like to do a squash and merge. What the squash and merge does is it takes all of those commits that we've worked on separately and it squashes them into a single commit that will show up in the main branch commit history. Otherwise, some of these other techniques will keep each commit that we had on our branch, and it'll keep those commits in our main branch history. So it's kind of a preference about how you like to do your merges. Would you like to see both of those new feature commits stay in the main branch as separate commits, in which case you might do a merge commit? Or would you like to squash up all of your work that you've been doing on this branch? And when we merge this pull request, just make a single commit to your main branch version history. That's what the squash and merge is about. These commits will be combined into one commit on your main branch. I like to do a squash and merge. So now I'm going to actually do this merge and click this button. What we see when we do a squash and merge is that it will do a single commit into the main branch, and any individual commit messages still have those commit messages like in the comments about this commit. So that's what the squash and merge does. You'll see here the commit messages from our two feature branch commits. All right, finally, clicking this button to squash and merge. Awesome. Now we see that from the pull request menu, this pull request has been merged. So now let's go check out the main branch, the homepage of our repository. And now we see that the main branch reflects all of those changes that we just merged in. So this is the pull request workflow. If we want to do some new work, we'll generally check out a new branch, make some commits, maybe make some mistakes, and it doesn't affect negatively our code on the main branch, which is assumed to be in a working state and looking good. It gives us the opportunity to experiment, maybe make some errors, and review that code in a formal way. We push our branch up to GitHub, create a pull request, which allows us to review and talk about those changes. From the pull request menu, we were able to merge those changes back into the main branch, and that's awesome. There's one more final step in this process. We're going to need to update our local code, and then we'll end our workshop. So right now we see that the code we merged in through the pull request interface is updated on our main branch on GitHub. We see 4 commits on the main branch on GitHub, including this single commit for our merged pull request. But locally right now, if we use GitHub desktop software and switch over to the main branch using the branch dropdown selector, our main branch locally is old, it's stale. So the final thing that we need to do before repeating this process over again is to fetch all of the changes that we made to our main branch on GitHub. So right now, our main branch locally only has 3 commits, but we need to fetch. So we see this button is prompting us to fetch or pull the changes down, download the changes from GitHub main branch. So we click this button to fetch and also pull. Now we see our main branch locally is synced up again with our remote repository. And locally, we now see this commit that we merged in through the pull request. So right now, our local code is up to date and synced with our remote repository. And now we're back on the main branch and we have completed this cycle, this pull request workflow. Now, if we want to repeat this workflow, we're on the main branch. We'll check out a new branch. We'll make some commits. We'll push them up, create a pull request, merge it in, and pull the changes down. So that's that cycle from start to finish.